Hey everyone, welcome back. We're really diving deep today on something super relevant, I think, for a lot of you out there, and that's disabled renters' rights, specifically here in California.
Right.
And we've got like a whole stack of FAQs, legal guides, all these summaries of different laws to really try to break this down, because honestly, it's something that I think gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah, it does. And a lot of people aren't even aware of a lot of the rights and protections in place. So
Totally. And, you know, honestly, until I even started looking through all this stuff, I didn't realize how much there was to unpack.
Right.
So maybe let's just start with the basics. When we say disability under the law, like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because it's actually broader than a lot of people think.
Okay.
So it does include like physical limitations, of course, but it can also include a whole bunch of different mental health conditions.
Wow. Okay.
And even temporary conditions, you know? So like, let's say someone is dealing with severe anxiety or they have PTSD. Things like that might actually qualify them for certain protections.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I thought it was way more narrow than that.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
So that's super important for people to know.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, now that we kind of have like a basic understanding of what disability means in this context,
Right.
what are some of those like key rights that disabled renters in California should be aware of?
Yeah. So one that often gets missed is that landlords can't ask you all these really intrusive questions about your disability.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't like pry into the specifics or demand your medical records, you know, just because you're applying to rent a place.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, your medical history shouldn't be a barrier to finding a place to live.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay, what about like actual changes to a property?
Right.
Like if someone needs a ramp installed or grab bars in the bathroom, like how does that work?
Yeah, so that falls under this thing called reasonable accommodations,
Okay.
which is like a big part of these laws.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to remember that accommodations aren't just about physical changes to the property.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like it could also include things like adjusting payment schedules
Oh, okay.
or maybe allowing a live-in aid if someone needs help with daily tasks.
I see. So it's more about like being flexible and adapting to the renter's needs.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that are well reasonable.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but I'm a little confused about the difference between like modifications and accommodations.
Right.
Like those words seem to kind of get used interchangeably sometimes.
Yeah, that's a common point of confusion.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. Modifications are the actual physical changes to the property, like adding those ramps or grab bars.
Okay.
And accommodations are more about adjusting like rules or policies.
Gotcha. Okay, so waiving a no pets rule for someone who has like an emotional support animal would be an accommodation.
Exactly.
And a modification.
Right, because you're changing the landlord's policy, not like actually physically changing the apartment. Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of animals,
Yeah.
this is something I know people have a lot of questions about.
Right.
So let's talk about the whole assistance animal situation. Like, what are the rules there for renters?
Yeah, so this is where disabled renters have like some really strong protections.
Okay.
Because landlords are actually required to make reasonable accommodations for both service animals and emotional support animals, even if they have a no pets policy in place.
Oh, wow. So even if my lease says no pets, like they can't just say no to someone with a service dog?
Nope. They have to make an exception.
Wow, okay.
And while a lot of people think of service animals as, you know, like dogs that are trained for specific tasks,
Right.
landlords also have to accommodate emotional support animals.
Okay, so how does that work?
Yeah.
Like, what if someone just says their pet is an emotional support animal just to, like, get around the rules?
Right. So usually there needs to be some kind of documentation from a healthcare professional to back that up. It's about finding that balance, you know, protecting the rights of disabled renters, but also making sure landlords aren't being taken advantage of.
Right, totally.
Yeah,
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of nuance to these laws.
definitely.
So let's say a landlord is, like, not respecting these rights.
Right.
Can a disabled renter still be evicted?
So this is where it can get tricky, and it's why knowing your rights is super important.
Okay.
So yes, a disabled renter can be evicted, but never for discriminatory reasons.
Oh, okay.
They're still bound by the terms of their lease, just like any other tenant.
Right, so, like, not paying rent or, like, causing damage to the property could still lead to eviction.
Absolutely.
Even if the renter is disabled.
Exactly. But if a landlord tries to evict someone just because of their disability or because they requested a reasonable accommodation,
Uh-huh.
that's illegal discrimination.
Okay, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah. It is.
So what can a renter do if they feel like they're being treated unfairly by their landlord?
So first and foremost, documentation is key. Like, keep records of everything.
Like what kind of stuff?
Communications with your landlord, any discriminatory actions,
Mm.
and especially any attempts to deny you a reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
Save emails, take screenshots of text messages, like anything that can serve as evidence later on.
So like building a case file just in case things escalate.
Exactly. And speaking of escalation, if you're facing discrimination or your rights are being violated, you're not alone. There are resources available to help.
Okay, let's talk about those resources.
Yeah.
What options are out there for renters who need support?
Well, in California, you can file a complaint with either HUD or the California DFEH.
Okay, so those are kind of like the go-to agencies if someone's dealing with discrimination or being denied a reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, they're a great starting point.
Okay.
They can investigate the situation, and often they'll actually help mediate disputes between renters and landlords.
Oh, okay.
And of course, seeking legal advice from a qualified attorney who specializes in tenant rights is always a good idea.
Yeah, I imagine that can make a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you're dealing with something as complex as housing law.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what defines a disability, those key rights renters should know.
Right.
About resources for people who are facing discrimination.
Uh-huh.
But I want to make sure we also talk about funding and assistance.
Yeah.
Like, are there programs out there that can help disabled renters with like the costs of housing?
Yeah, there are. And this can be huge for people, especially those on fixed incomes.
Sure.
So, for example, Section 8 vouchers can be used to help subsidize rent payments,
Okay.
which can make housing way more affordable.
Right.
And there's also HUD funding that can help with various housing-related costs as well.
I've also heard of some nonprofit organizations that offer grants specifically for disabled renters.
Yeah, for sure. There's a whole network of support out there if you know where to look.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got federal programs.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier that California has its own set of laws and resources.
Yes, exactly. So it's always a good idea to check with your local housing agencies to see what's available in your specific area.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to recap, we've talked about what defines a disability, those key rights renters should know, resources for those facing discrimination, and even financial assistance programs.
Mm-hmm.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, which was California's own specific laws.
Right.
Like, how do those differ from the federal laws?
Yeah. So California actually tends to have some of the strongest tenant protections in the country.
Wow. Look out.
So the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FESHA, is a key piece of legislation.
Okay.
It's similar to federal law, but it often goes further in protecting renters.
So it's like California took the federal protections and was like, we could do even better.
You could say that FESHA covers a lot of the same ground as federal law,
Okay.
but it might have some unique nuances that are specific to California. So, for instance, FEHA very explicitly prohibits discrimination based on a person's source of income.
Oh, interesting. So like a landlord can't refuse to rent to someone just because they receive disability benefits?
Exactly. That would be a violation of FEHA.
Wow.
And this protection actually extends to other types of income as well.
Like what?
Like Section 8 vouchers or assistance from nonprofit organizations.
Oh, that's a huge protection.
It is especially for disabled renters who might rely on those sources of income to afford housing.
Totally. What else stands out to you about FEHA?
Well, FEHA also has a broader definition of what constitutes a reasonable accommodation compared to federal law.
Okay.
So that means that California courts tend to be more tenant-friendly when evaluating requests for accommodations.
Interesting. So if a renter in California requests an accommodation, they might have a better chance of having it approved.
It's definitely a possibility, yeah. California courts have a history of interpreting FEHA in a way that favors broader protections for tenants, especially those with disabilities.
Okay. That's something for our California listeners to keep in mind for sure.
Absolutely.
Are there any other noteworthy aspects of FEHA that we should touch on?
Yeah, one more thing I'd like to highlight is that FEHA puts a big emphasis on preventing retaliation against tenants who assert their rights.
So, what does that mean?
So basically, a landlord can't do anything to punish a renter for requesting an accommodation or filing a complaint about discrimination.
Okay.
So, they can't raise the rent or try to evict them just because they stood up for their rights. It's about making sure that renters feel safe advocating for themselves.
That makes sense. That's really important.
It creates a much fairer playing field.
Yeah, for sure. As we're going through all of this, I keep thinking back to how crucial documentation is.
Absolutely.
Can we dive a little deeper into that? What kind of records should disabled renters be keeping just in case they need to take action against a landlord?
Yeah, it's always better to err on the side of caution and just document as much as possible.
What kind of things?
Keep copies of your lease agreement, any correspondence with your landlord, whether it's emails, letters, even text messages. And any records of repairs or maintenance requests you've made.
Oh, so even something as simple as a text message asking the landlord to fix a leaky faucet could be valuable evidence later on.
It could, because it creates a timeline and shows that you've been proactive in communicating with your landlord.
Oh, okay.
And if you've requested any reasonable accommodations, keep detailed records of those requests. It's like the date what you asked for and the landlord's response.
What if a landlord agrees to an accommodation verbally but never puts it in writing?
Right.
Should renters push for written confirmation?
It's always a good idea to get things in writing whenever possible.
Okay.
Because that prevents misunderstandings and can be super helpful if a dispute arises later.
That's good advice. It sounds like just the act of documenting things can be really empowering for renters.
It can.
It gives them a sense of control and can help build a stronger case if they ever need to assert their rights.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about being informed, proactive, and prepared.
Yeah, love it.
And speaking of being prepared, we should probably talk about what to expect if a renter actually needs to file a formal complaint with HUD or the DFEH.
Right.
Okay? I mean, it can feel kind of daunting,
Oh, for sure.
Or actually file a complaint.
Yeah.
But it's often a necessary step in protecting your rights.
Right. So it's good to know, what to expect.
Yeah.
So walk us through that process. What happens after a renter files a complaint with, HUD or the DFEH?
Okay, so the first thing you got to do is gather all that documentation.
Okay.
Submit a complaint form to the right agency.
Okay.
And then from there, they're going to launch an investigation.
Okay.
And that usually involves interviewing both you and the landlord, collecting evidence, and reviewing all those records that you've been keeping.
So it's like a little mini investigation to figure out if discrimination actually happened.
Exactly. They're trying to see if there's enough evidence to support your claim.
Okay. And if they do find evidence, what happens then? Does it automatically become a legal battle?
Not always. Usually the agency will first try to mediate a resolution between the renter and the landlord.
Okay.
So that might mean the landlord agrees to make those reasonable accommodations or pay damages or take some other steps to fix the situation.
So there's a chance that things can get resolved without going to court.
Yeah. Often mediation is successful.
Okay.
But if that doesn't work, or if the discrimination was really bad, the agency can actually pursue legal action against the landlord.
Wow. Okay.
So there are ways to hold landlords accountable.
That's good to know. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
But even with all those resources available, I imagine it can still be super stressful and confusing for renters going through that.
Oh, definitely. It's a lot.
So it probably makes a huge difference to have expert legal advice, right?
Absolutely. Navigating housing law is complex.
Yeah.
And having an attorney on your side can really make all the difference. They can help you understand your rights, gather the right documentation, and just build the strongest possible case.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so it's definitely worth looking into legal aid organizations or attorneys who specialize in tenant rights.
Okay, great advice. This has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah, it is.
And we've only just scratched the surface of disabled renters' rights.
I think you're right. It's a dense topic.
It is.
But hopefully our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of their rights and the resources that are out there to help them.
I think so, too. Before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked about federal laws,
Yeah.
California-specific laws, reasonable accommodations, assistance animals, the process of filing a complaint, all this stuff.
Right.
But at the end of the day, what does it all mean for you?
Yeah.
How can you take this knowledge and actually use it to advocate for yourself and create a more equitable housing landscape for everyone?
That's the question, isn't it?
It did be. We'll be back after a short break to wrap things up and offer some concluding thoughts. All right, and we're back, wrapping up our super in-depth look at disabled renters' rights here in California.
I know.
I don't know about you, but I feel like I could write a book after all this.
Seriously, right? I mean, it's amazing how much is packed into all those guides and FAQs and stuff.
I know it's dense, but hopefully we've managed to make it a little bit more digestible.
Yeah.
And, helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, exactly.
We covered, federal laws like the Fair Housing Act, then California's own version, FICA, all that good stuff. Reasonable accommodations, assistance.
Yeah.
Animals, how to file a complaint if your rights are violated.
It's a lot.
It is a lot.
But hey, knowledge is power, right?
That's what they say.
Yep.
Especially when it comes to something as important as like where you live.
Sure.
Your housing.
Absolutely.
And I think, it's important to remember that this is really just a starting point. Like every situation is different. So it's always best to talk to like a legal professional or a housing advocate if you have like specific questions or concerns.
Yeah, definitely they can give you that more personalized guidance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with one final like thought-provoking question.
Okay, hit me.
What part of disabled renters' rights surprised you the most today? Was it the fact that like so many different conditions are covered under the law?
Yeah.
Or like how strong California's FIHA protections are, or maybe just how important it is to document everything.
Right.
Whatever it was. I'm curious how this new knowledge might change the way you think about housing in the future.
Yeah.
Whether you're a renter or even a landlord,
It's definitely something to think about.
Right.
We all have a role to play in making housing more fair and accessible for everyone.
I love that. Such a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep advocating for a better future for all.
Call now 71444299741. Thank you.